Okay, welcome to Chapter 3 of System Analysis and Design. This chapter is all about managing system projects. And so we're talking about using Gantt charts and those kind of things in order to help you manage a complex system to keep it on track. So, starting up on page 88, I'm going to go through the chapter objectives like we always do. So you're supposed to be able to explain project planning, scheduling, monitoring, and reporting. Draw the project triangle that shows a relationship among cost, scope, and time. Describe work breakdown structure, WBS. Task patterns and critical path analysis. Explain the techniques for estimating task completion times and cost. Describe various scheduling tools to include Gantt charts, PERT charts. Analyze task dependencies, duration, start and end times. Describe project management software. Discuss the importance of managing project risks. And understand why projects sometimes fail. Okay, so on page 90, they basically talk about, kind of an overview of project management. And they say, what shapes a project? What really defines it? And they have a kind of a definition. It says, successful projects must be completed on time, within budget, meet requirements, and satisfy users. Well, yeah, that's kind of sort of obvious. And then they show this this project triangle. And the project triangle is this little guy, where you have one of the constraints being cost, one of them is being the scope or the quality of the project, and another one just being time. You've probably seen this in lots of things. There's lots of little funny signs out there. We offer 3 kinds of service. Good, cheap, and fast. You can pick any 2. This is the exact same scenario as what we're talking about here. Yes, keeping this center on bubble, so to speak, is complex because sometimes time will be fixed and you can't change it. Therefore, it's going to either cost more or you're going to have to reduce scope in order to get to where you're going. I'm not going to go through all the scenarios because you guys can figure this out. If the scope is fixed, well then, the other things have to move to accommodate it. Okay. So the next thing they talk about basically is what do project managers do? What do you do for a living if you consider yourself a project manager? So we're just going to go through a little thing here. It talks about good leadership is essential because you are going to be not just managing projects, you're going to be managing those pesky little human beings, and that takes a different kind of skill set. So project planning, identifying all project tasks, estimating the completion time and the cost. That makes sense. Project scheduling, yeah. Create specific timetable that show all the tasks, the task dependencies, the critical paths that might delay the project. Then project monitoring, guiding, supervising, and coordinating the project and the workload of the team. So yes, you can't just throw this thing into motion. You really have to write it, check. So this monitoring thing has become a science. There's an awful lot of companies out there that specialize in specific software and specific techniques you can use to monitor a project to make sure it's still on track. We're going to use a couple of those tools here in just a moment. And then last one is the project reporting. When you're reporting internally, you can be very, very specific. You can use like a PERT chart to talk about exactly where you are in the schedule. When you start reporting to the outside, corporate management or somebody who's coming by to look, well, then you're probably going to use a Gantt chart because it's colorful, it's graphical, and there's not quite so much detail in there. So, as I mentioned before, what a lot of people do, we had a giant plotter, and we would go in and produce this Gantt chart, and we would plot it on a plotter. So it'd be like 3 feet high and like 6 or 7 feet long, and we would paste it on the wall. And everybody would come by and they go, oh wow, well here's where we are in the project. You can kind of do a chalk talk, so to speak, by just walking up to the wall. Pretty cool technique. Pretty cool use of a giant plotter too. Okay. So the step one in their process is to create what they call a work breakdown structure, WBS. WBS is kind of an industry term. It's used by an awful lot of companies to mean essentially the same thing, but the context of it might be a little different. For example, if you're using an enterprise resource management program of some sort, particularly one that's put together by SAP, they use a WBS as a technique for assigning cost to a particular task. So this WBS code is a common thing that they talk about over and over again. This is not quite that specific, but the concept is the same. And the whole point is that you break something down into smaller chunks. And you get to the smallest chunk that makes sense, then that becomes a WBS. Okay. A lot of people use Microsoft Project to kind of help demonstrate these things, like through a Gantt chart. So there's an example here. This is a Microsoft Project Gantt chart. And these tasks here, I mean, they're not very descriptive here, but these tasks have a beginning date and end date. They also have a little completion. The little yellow line shows me that this one is, about 75% complete. These tasks are WBSs. So those individual little tasks that all have to kind of come together. Okay, so I mentioned this is a Gantt chart, and Gantt charts are pretty cool. And it's not the only chart in the world. In fact, a lot of people prefer the Gantt chart only for showing people to the, outside your group. And they use a PERT chart internally because it provides a lot more detail, and it's a lot easier to build a schedule from a PERT chart than it is from a Gantt chart. And it's a lot easier to go in there and tweak things like, Susie's going to be on leave for a week. What's that going to do to my schedule, kind of a thing. Now, the book talks about how the PERT and CPM charts were created. It's kind of a cool story, so we'll kind of go through it. That the PERT was put together by the Navy when they were first building their nuclear submarine program, and it's pretty complex, and it can solve lots and lots of changes to a schedule. And about the same time that the Navy was putting theirs together, the rest of the industry was putting together one that's basically called a critical path method, which is, quite frankly, the same. So nowadays, when you say PERT, I really mean PERT or CPM. So don't get too bogged down in the terminology. It's that type of charting, that type of analysis, that type of tool, regardless of what we actually call it. Okay, so on page 93, they talk about, which is better? I mean, a PERT chart or a Gantt chart? Well, the Gantt is provides you some these really cool snapshots. For example, in this diagram, today's date has a little line through it, and you can exactly, at a quick glance, you could look at it and go, wow, we're ahead of schedule, or no, we're not, or oh my God, there's an awful lot of work coming up, or something. However, the PERT is a little bit more powerful, and it's more easily adapted to creating a work schedule for people. So monitoring and controlling the actual work, PERT displays complex task patterns and relationships rather than just kind of this linear thing. Life could be a lot more complex than just, step 1, step 2, step 3. PERT charts boxes can provide a lot more detail. And you guys know what we're talking about. Let's pretend like this is a construction project, and you're working on a 3-story building, and you're arranged for the roofing material to arrive on Monday, and the crane to lift the roofing material up to the 3rd floor is going to arrive on Tuesday. So everything's cool, and then you get a call saying, the crane is stuck at the other job site, and it's going to be another week. It's like, oh man. So yeah. There are very, very tight relationships between these tasks, and often, rarely do these tasks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 have standalone. They almost all are interrelated. So again, you can use a Gantt chart to show relationships, but it's actually a little easier to use a PERT to do so. Okay, And there's some pretty cool pictures in the book that kind of explain the little boxes and show how things kind of relate. I kind of like that on page 93 and 94. Okay, so continuing along. So you have to identify the task in the WBS. That kind of makes sense. So it must clearly identify each task and include an estimated duration. In addition to the tasks, either the task name or a task ID, one of the two, have to be unique. You can't say, crane arrival, and then someplace else you put crane arrival a second time. I need to be able to know if that's the same item we're talking about or these things are unique. So you have to have either unique names or a unique ID behind the name so that you end up with some clarity on what it is you're actually talking about. So it's got to have a task or an activity, and it talks about any type of work that has to happen. And so typically that means it has an estimated start and a duration, or an estimated date, end date, and duration. Rarely do you use all three. You either have a start date and it's going to take this long, or an end date, it has to be done by this time, and so you back the schedule back. Rarely do you provide all three because it doesn't provide you any flexibility. If you had a start date and a duration, if you change the start date, it just kind of moves over, right? No big deal. And if you had an end date and a duration and the end date changed, well then everything just kind of slides back and forth. But if you put in start date, end date, and duration, and then you go into your Gantt chart and want to make a change, well, it's going to say, well, which end of this it takes precedence? I mean, is it the beginning date? So it's going to get a little confused. So most people recommend that you use just two of the three. Although you could say, well, if you give me two, I can calculate the third. Well, yeah, okay, that's true. However, what we're really saying is, what has precedence? Is it the starting date that has precedence? Is it the ending date that has precedence? Okay, so once again, these tasks are these basic units of work that the project manager plans, schedules, and monitors to make things happen. Now, a WBS, in a strange sense, can also be a resource. For example, the crane. The crane is going to appear on the work site for 5 days, and then it's going to leave, and it's going to go to some other work site. In another scenario that might be a little bit more familiar to you guys is you're putting together a project and you want to schedule the conference room, and you have to look at the schedule and go, oh well, the conference room is a resource. It's a resource that I need for my project. And I have to look at the schedule and find out when the conference room is going to be available. And I plug that in my chart, and then I move things around to see that it matches when that resource is going to be available. So some resources kind of drive the schedule. For example, if the crane doesn't show up on time, well, okay, you're in deep. Okay, so that's a little bit more about these work breakdown structures. Another example is sometimes there are specific points or events or milestones that happen. Some tasks just kind of get to the end and okay, they're done. Other tasks that get to the end and there's a thing, like you're publishing a document. For example, I'm writing a contract and I get to the point where the contract's open. That's a good point. So sometimes you have an event in your PERT chart, Gantt chart, which is a single item. That event occurs all in one day. And so it shows up as a little diamond rather than a little bar. It shows up as a little diamond saying things. Well, so in this particular example, you work on a questionnaire, you get it approved, all the questions are distributed, and they're all returned, and you tabulate them, and you have a result. You could say that these little things are these milestones. Boom, 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 boom. The date that bids are going to be in. Yeah, that's a good date to put down. Okay, so continuing on page 95, they talk about, what all you have to do. Well, you have to list all the tasks. That kind of makes sense. Make a list of them all. Put them in order of execution. That kind of makes sense. Add a description, decide how long each task is going to last, and decide what tasks must come before others. So this is a good place to stop at the 15-minute mark, and I'll see you again in just a few.